Morning, everybody, and welcome to what will be a very interesting and timely presentation this morning by Dr. Ellie Hartman, who is the project manager for the Wisconsin Promise Project. The title of her presentation this morning, Lessons Learned from Wisconsin Promise, a focused look at improving employment outcomes for youth receiving SSI. A couple of notes before I turn it over to Dr. Hartman. For those of you that have been on the webinars before, this will be old information for you that are new. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. If you have questions about technical issues, please put those in the chat box. This morning's presentation is a live presentation, a bit different than some of our earlier webinars. So the questions will be answered at the end of Dr. Hartman's presentation. And again, Heidi Decker-Mauer and others will let you know that questions that we don't get to, we will get answered, and we will be posting them on our website, but we'll let you know that again at the end. And one last piece, the webinar this morning does qualify for CRC credits. You will be receiving an email tomorrow, those of you that have attended the webinar, about with instructions about how to request the CRC credits for this webinar. So with that, I will turn over to Dr. Hartman for today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Welcome, everyone. Seems like we have a good number of you folks joining us today. I am going to open things up, make sure everything's ready here. Looks like it. All right. As Terry mentioned, I'm going to be talking about Wisconsin Promise, our lessons learned. And just to dive right in, Wisconsin Promise and the other Promise programs, which were research demonstration programs to better identify, connect, and engage youth receiving supplemental security income in the transition process in order to increase employment, education, employment, and self-sufficiency outcomes. And so really with these projects, and this ties into the Project E3 objectives, is we really needed to better identify and connect youth receiving supplemental security income and their families. We enrolled them when they were 14, 15, and 16. Youth receiving SSI had a Social Security disability determination and also family income deemed low enough. So really it's that cross intersection between poverty and disability that we were really looking at and connecting them to employment and income. And so typical outreach, as we'll get into, wasn't sufficient to connect with youth and families. With all this happening, the other piece to keep in mind is, as I mentioned, we're early intervention youth as young as 14, starting no later than 16 in this project. And when thinking about that, we have different pieces that have, some of it was in context when we started back in April 2014, some of it has emerged since. So looking at the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, and pre-employment transition services, which were coming on board right about the same time we were enrolling folks in Promise. So for that, really helping inform what we were doing here in Wisconsin. In addition, college and career ready individual education programs, or IEPs, along with those post-secondary transition plans. Most our youth had an IEP, not all, but that's another context to consider. And then here in Wisconsin, we were adding academic career plans, and that's for every youth, whether they had a disability or not, starting at the age of 14, doing academic career planning, and then also connecting with other services and supports, for example, school social workers, school nurses, school homeless liaisons. So that's the school side of things, but also, and I'll get into this further, long-term care and mental health resources as well. So what is Promise? I started talking about this. It's randomized controlled design. It's really a demonstration project to see what works for youth receiving SSI, really to increase, as I mentioned before, those education, employment, and financial self-sufficiency outcomes. There's 6 demonstration sites nationally, so Wisconsin's one of them, and then Arkansas, California, Maryland, New York, and then a consortium of states that included Utah, Colorado, both the Dakotas, Montana, and Arizona. And really, services started, as I mentioned, back April 2014. Enrollment ended April 2016, and then youth and families received services for 2.5 to 5 years. Most services stopped September 30th, 2018. In Wisconsin, we did a couple other things, but that's really the time period. So now that services have ended, we can really talk about lessons learned. One big benefit of this grant is we did receive a lot of money with the goal of that money mainly to be spent on services and supports, not only for youth, but for the whole family. And the other big piece of this grant was interagency collaboration, both at the federal and the state level. So the grants that each state received were through the Department of Education, as well as the Technical Assistance Center, AUCD, and then in partnership with the Social Security Administration that provided the funding for the national research that Mathematica conducted and is continuing to conduct, but also in partnership with the Department of Labor, thinking specifically of the Office of Employment and Disability Policy, and then the Department of Health and Human Services. So it was an interagency collaboration at the national level, but also at the state level. So all those partners were present at the national level. It was also expected that we had all those partners collaborating at the state level. And this was really important to ensure that we provided wraparound resources for youth and families as we were working with them. Really coordinating services and connecting to resources and supports already available through the state and supplementing them with the Promise services as they made sense. So we enrolled, each project was required to enroll at least 2,000 youth and their families, which we did. As I mentioned, they were 14, 15, and 16, receiving supplemental security income when they enrolled, and we enrolled both the youth and their family members. So half received services as usual, and the other half got the treatment package. So what that meant in Wisconsin was youth and their youth were automatically enrolled in Wisconsin Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, or DVR services. And they got a Promise DVR counselor that were assigned a Promise specific DVR counselor that case managed and ensured you got all the Promise services in addition to the typical VR services. In addition, families received a family service plan through the youth DVR case, and could receive the similar services towards their own education, employment, and financial self-sufficiency goals. And then the other piece was each youth, we built the Promise DVR counselor built interagency resource teams. So identified the different folks, whether they are and that, of course, included the youth and family, for youth and family voice, of course, DVR, school, long-term care, mental health, foster care, juvenile justice, other natural supports, you name it. Those were all listed. Providers were included. And then the key components of the grant, which included employment services. So the aim was at least one paid job, preferably 2 prior to exiting high school. And then because everyone was receiving SSI, and I know Project E3 just did a series of webinars on this, the work incentive benefits counseling. So if you're working, what does that mean? Really focused in on, student earned income exclusion. We also utilize the work incentive called Section 301, that as our youth got older, not all of them were eligible for SSI as an adult, but they could continue SSI payments as long as they continued in an employment-related program, Promise or VR. So we continued youth receiving SSI benefits as they completed their path to completing their employment goal. Once they reached that goal, had their job, those payments would stop, but it provided them a way of continuing that income as they journeyed on their path to employment. But in addition, Promise really sought to increase financial self-sufficiency. So yeah, looking at benefits, yes, getting employed and increasing income, but also are they building assets, really looking at budgeting, managing budgeting, and increasing that financial picture, not only for today, but through the future. So we also included financial coaching, ways to save money through individual development accounts, which I'll talk about later. And then some of those pre-employment transition services, or PREETs, as they're commonly known through WIOA. So on-the-job social skills training, which we did through Skills Through the Pay the Bills, which has since been operationalized through our DVR program. In addition, also family and self-advocacy training. So self-advocacy training, another one of those PREETs, but we also worked with families to both increase expectations and help with resource navigation. And then we decided to throw one more piece in on Wisconsin, was the health promotion piece with our youth. And that really focusing in just briefly, just an introduction on the health promotion. And the other thing I wanted to point out with each Promise program, these core components, the employment services, work incentive benefits, counseling, and financial planning, the pre-employment transition services, the connection with families, and the interagency collaboration were all core requirements of each Promise program. So this whole model was demonstrated across the 6 different sites. So what did our folks look like? What were their demographics? This was a bit of a surprise, especially when we looked at primary disability type. I think originally the thought was SSI. We're thinking a lot about individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities, and about 30% of youth did identify intellectual developmental disability as their primary disability right on that intake form when they first enrolled. But we actually had a higher percentage, 34%, who identified mental health or behavioral as their primary. And then another 25% that identified other, and this was some of the more non-obvious disabilities, so speech and language, maybe ADHD, other types of behavioral related. So that was a large percentage. Now it was SSI, so it was the whole gamut of any disability qualified through the Social Security disability determination. So we also had individuals with physical disabilities, long-term care illnesses. We had individuals with sensory disabilities. So the full gamut, but those were at much smaller percentages. Race and ethnicity, yes, this is a Wisconsin project, and yes, our primary group was African American. 49%, almost half our youth identified as African American. This percentage was even higher in our Milwaukee area. So we had about 40% of our participants in Milwaukee area. In fact, we saw higher percentages of individuals in more urban areas compared to rural areas. Although we did have a good number of folks in rural areas as well. We actually served youth in all 72 Wisconsin counties. We were statewide. So we did have a diverse makeup, but it definitely leaned more towards urban, more towards African American, and this was consistent with who's receiving SSI in Wisconsin. In addition, 36% identified as white, and that was 8% in Milwaukee. And then statewide, it's about the same, 10, 11% identified as Hispanic. Most youth and families identified as primary English speaking, 95%, but we did have a good number of families who spoke Spanish, some who spoke Hmong, and some a couple other different languages. So we, of course, provided those accommodations as needed. The other thing is 2/3 of the population was male. Again, this is consistent with the numbers who are receiving SSI. So that gives you somewhat of a sense of when we're talking about youth 14 to 16 who enrolled in Promise, who we were working with. In addition, remember that to be eligible, the household income needed to be deemed low enough. So most households had lower income, 33% statewide, 40% in Milwaukee, identified less than $10,000 a year annually. And this is not only earned income, this is any income. And then additional 37% statewide, 35% Milwaukee, between 10,000 and 25,000 a year. And then some over 25,000 a year, but it wasn't that much more over. So it wasn't a lot of money coming in. The other thing is most families identified as single parent households, 66% statewide, 77% in Milwaukee. The good news is most youth reported a good, at least physical health, 85%. I mentioned most our students had an IEP, individual education program at school at enrollment, 84%. But there were some without. Not everyone was going to public school. Not everyone's disability was impacting their education. And we didn't, unfortunately, we should have, but we didn't collect information on 504 plans. In addition, looking at long-term care, which we thought was going to be a higher percentage, but about 10% were connected to children's long-term care services. I'll get to this later, but that does increase throughout the project. And we look specifically at the subpopulation as well. Other benefits that families are receiving, 2/3 reported receiving food share, or also commonly referred to as SNAP benefits. The other pieces are 60% reported other household members receiving SSDI, or Social Security Disability Insurance. Some also had household members also receiving SSI, 22%. And then 12% reported housing assistance, and then a smaller percentage reported connected to TANF, 4% as part of Wisconsin Works. And this might be because of the work requirements associated with the program, whereas SSI does not have such requirements, which lends itself to show that some of the families were really dependent on the use SSI check to maintain household expenses. So no wrong door. Each state is trying to operate so that there's no wrong door, the interagency services run smoothly. How's that working for Wisconsin Promise? And what we found is, even though we have a lot of services and supports, and folks were eligible for a lot of services and supports when youth receiving SSI, with poverty in life every day in poverty, that just can get in the way. Living day to day makes it difficult to jump through all the required hoops to access services needed. Just getting somewhere to fill out an application, or filling out an application online, attending appointments as needed. Sometimes other things come up that are higher priority when you're worried about enough food on the table and a roof over the head. And so you really started to think through in the Promise program, how can we better reach out and really meet families where they're at? The other thing was training and services were not as user-friendly as we would like them to be, when we start to account for those hardships of poverty. So youth and families had histories of trauma. So were they trauma informed? Were we really ensuring that in the environments that they walked into, how we responded to folks, how services were delivered? Basic needs, if their basic needs aren't being attended to, it's really hard to engage in the services and supports available. So how do we connect to those resources? Ambivalence. Folks were kind of on the fence. Yes, they wanted to increase employment, but can that really happen? And there's all these competing factors. So are we utilizing structures like motivational interviewing to really get the input of where folks want to go and how they want to get there? Super important versus dictating that path and getting that met with resistance. Training structure, so used to training knowledge and lessons learned through theory, but our youth and families really benefited more for hands-on practical instruction. Which skills to pay the bills provides format to do that? Are we adjusting those curriculum to make sure that hands-on learning is available no matter the disability? So really looking on that hands-on practical instruction, not only for that social skills, on-the-job social skills training, but also for things like financial planning and capability building. Are we implementing more practical instruction? And then, as I mentioned before, are we truly meeting the youth and family where they're at and moving from that place? So one of the things we really demonstrated in Wisconsin Promise, now Wisconsin Promise was unique in that really what the way it was structured was through our division of vocational rehabilitation. So I'm going to focus on the importance of that and why our youth and families really benefited from that structure. Knowing that the exact structure that we utilized in Wisconsin is not always possible state to state, but really understanding the important component of connecting youth receiving SSI to Voc Rehab services if that's possible. What we saw is that so with treatment group, 100% were connected to Voc Rehab, right? And we also saw higher employment rates. In addition, when we looked at the control group who did connect to VR, we saw higher employment rates. And then also with the treatment group, those who had paid work experiences, training on the job also had higher employment rates. So getting those early employment experiences, whether it's through the support of Voc Rehab, through school transition programs, Project Search, or even local WIOA Title I programs available to youth through Title I, job centers, youth apprenticeship programs, internships. How are we connecting youth to those early work experiences? Of course, Voc Rehab helps to navigate that, especially with WIOA and pre-employment transition services, but also connecting to the youth programs available through local jobs centers or employment and training programs. So in Wisconsin, 89% of our Promise youth, so 100% connected to VR, 89% of our Promise youth had at least one face-to-face meeting with their Wisconsin DVR counselor, and an additional 8% had at least one phone conversation. So 88%, so most connected with a Promise DVR counselor at least once. Obviously, our preference was face-to-face, if at all possible, but you still had that connection with the few that we were unable to get face-to-face. With that, 88% had an individual plan for employment through VR, so their IPE. And after that IPE was written, we looked at engagement rates. So were they highly engaged? About half were. 23% had mixed engagement, in and out, and 27% had low engagement. So that really meant we had to structure our services and supports to promote engagement across all those groups throughout the project. With all our efforts, 71% of Promise Youth did receive employment services. And here's the outline of the different service or the numbers. So 914 of youth had any service. I mentioned IPEs. Most had a family resource team identified as well. And then we had, in addition to that, we had 487 family service plans written for 652 family members. And I forgot to mention earlier, if the youth or the family members, were eligible, we also connected them to their own VR case. So additional 109 family members were connected to VR. I mentioned 713 with employment service. And then here's the Promise specific services. Almost 600 met with a Promise family advocate, that family advocacy piece. And a good number of them completed the family advocacy modules. Almost that much, the same number met with a financial coach. 377 identified having a savings account. Just over 500 met with a work incentive benefits specialist and completed the skills to pay the bills training. Almost 500 completed the self-advocacy modules, and about a third completed the health promotion piece. So when all was said and done, connecting and engaging youth and families to VR and Promise services led to increases in employment rates for youth. So we see with the treatment group, 2/3, 67% if you look from April 2014 to September 2018, did they ever have a job according to our UI wage records? 67% in the treatment group compared to 57% in the control group. That's a 10 percentage point difference of youth with a paid work experience early on in high school. If you look at the control group that never connected to Voc Rehab, so I mentioned about a third did, well, 2/3 didn't. If you look at that, you see even lower employment rates, about half, just over half, had some paid work experience. So this combination of services and supports had an impact on youth who received a paid job during this early transition period. In addition, a small percentage, about 78 youth, earned substantial gainful activity. We found that when we identified interagency folks and had that wraparound service and worked with other agencies, we saw higher employment rates. So if there's a school person identified, that employment rate jumped to 70%. If there was a long-term case manager identified, that jumped to 71%. And then we saw, if we looked over for the long-term care population, remember at enrollment, about 10% were with long-term care. Since then, more youth connected to long-term care services, so that increased. And then when we looked at employment rates, that increased more in the treatment group than the control group. And then when we looked at employment rates were higher in the treatment versus control. So for treatment group, 52% of those in long-term care and also in Promise had a job during that period, compared to a third in the control group. So employment rates were a little lower for those with long-term care services, but we were able to increase treatment group employment rates for those in long-term care by quite a bit more treatment versus control. What this graph provides is a look across quarters. So that was whether they were employed at all throughout the period from April 2014 to September 2018. And you can see, looking at this graph, increases started right when as folks started to enroll. So here's the enrollment period. You see employment rates starting to rise already for the treatment group, and even more so once enrollment ended and everyone was on board. And these spikes are summer months. So we saw more employment during summer months, which makes a lot of sense. And then that compares to the control group the full control group, and then also the control without a VR case. So you can see the changes quarter by quarter. And then when you look at whether or not they connected to employment service, you also see that employment rates are higher when folks connected to an employment service. So assessment, skills to pay the bills, you see job exploration counseling, higher employment rates, 77%, 81%, and even higher when they start to have on-the-job types of training like trial work experiences, work-based learning experiences, on-the-job training. And we did connect a lot of youth to supported employment during this period, about 20. You see more participated in the trial work experiences and other options. But when we did, we actually had 100% employment rate. So these last two graphs, this one and this one, actually come from a recently published journal article that is in the Journal of Vocational Rehabilitation. And they actually have a new special double issue on Promise. And it's actually open access. Anyone can read not only about Wisconsin Promise, but all the different Promise projects. Don't let this amount fool you. If you scroll right down, all of these are open access. Oops. To anyone, you'll see unlocked, so you can get the PDF. The early intervention article I mentioned is on here, as well as we did a publication on work incentive benefits counseling, but you see like here's Maryland's, one of Maryland's articles. Here's the early findings. So those two graphs come from this article. And then we did a cost benefit analysis on continuing some of these services now that Promise is over. How much will that cost, and what's the benefit of doing so? But there's also wonderful publications. I can't get into all of them without taking too much time from the other Promise projects as well that you can please feel free to check out. All right. So in addition to the work, the employment services, when youth and families engaged in the other Promise-specific services like benefits counseling, financial coaching, having a savings account, meeting with that family advocate, completing those modules, and completing self-advocacy, we also saw increases in employment rates. And we also have a one-pager available, promisewi.com/success. If you want to see some of our infographics on our results, feel free to check those out as well. It also includes a lessons learned document on that. One of the things we were able to pull together with all these specific services and supports and having an impact and knowing that there's a lot to coordinate at the transition level. You have Medicaid, so healthcare, long-term care, mental health services, you have school, as I mentioned, the IEPs and the post-secondary transition plans, and even the academic career planning. You have workforce support, so Voc Rehab, youth apprenticeships, employment and training programs. You have child welfare. So a good number of youth actually were in foster care, child welfare programs, and eligible for independent living center supports. And then Wisconsin Works, we had transitional jobs programs. So that's a lot to navigate. So actually in Promise, what we did was developed a transition guide. Now this is Wisconsin specific, but I know other states have talked, Employment Resources Incorporated developed this for Promise, and we actually didn't put any Promise logos on it because we wanted, schools are actually requesting this, and other folks are requesting this guide, and you can go through here and navigate here, but it really has the core components that we included in Promise, and also links to resources. A paper copy is kind of nice. It's a nice size. It's got fold out activities, fun things there. But we also have PDF versions in English, Spanish, and Hmong, all available. And we do printed copies in English, Spanish, and Hmong. So if you're in Wisconsin, that might be an interest to you right now. We are printing them. The grant is paying for all printed copies. And we're monitoring those orders. Like I said, I just did a presentation over at the Transition Academy for Wisconsin special educators, and we we've got a lot of positive response on putting this. And it was really a collaborative effort across the different agencies to build this, and definitely based on lessons learned in Promise. So I wanted to share that. Okay. Wanted to highlight a couple of our services that's come up again and again of very specific to Promise that really helped contribute and were unique factors. So one of the things when we're talking about poverty, there was a lot of different crises that were happening in families. So we tried to set up these family advocacy group trainings to talk about increasing expectations, navigating resources, and even though folks were signing up, we were getting low attendance. Well, things were happening. There was one training where one family didn't show up because another family member in another youth in their family got shot. So definitely the priority to attend to that. Another one because one of her kids left an infant with her and she wasn't sure if she could bring the infant to the training, which of course we would have welcomed the baby, but didn't know us very well. And so what we found with all this stuff going on in life, we needed to build in supports more one-on-one. And so we transfer a model of training to family peer support and actually hired we called them Promise family advocates, but they were peers, folks with lived experience, folks with a youth with a disability, folks who've navigated the system before. Some of them were even Promise parents. And they really helped to identify and navigate supports, increase those expectations of what's possible, help youth with their self-advocacy, and really meeting the families where they're at. And then the important piece of that was not only to help with immediate concerns, but then also work with the family to go from emergency to emergency to really working towards those employment goals, those long-term goals. Okay, so we can help you with this month, but what are we going to do next month? What's the plan? So really taking and walk, and the family advocates and the DVR counselors would walk with the families through that path. The other feature I wanted to highlight was the Wisconsin Promise individual development accounts that we had available. And with work incentive benefits counseling, the financial capability building, we wanted to provide a way for folks to start banking and saving money. So we have Promise individual development accounts. And in those, they would, we helped with that initial $25 deposit, and then they saved up to $250 in that account. Once they reach that savings goal, we'd matched 1,000, so a 4-to-1 match there, and towards the purchase of help with their education, employment, and financial goals. So that could be transportation focused. A lot of folks bought cars, maybe housing, employment focused. So like equipment for employment, like a camera system, a storage organization system to help youth get to job. A big one was financial debt. So a lot of, especially family members, were in debt that were preventing them with getting a job because of financial background checks. So we helped with financial debt as long as it occurred prior to starting their IEDA, of course. And we had 525 IDAs open, 290 of them were youth, 214 parents, and 21 in the household. And they used them. We had quite a few IDAs where they this is the total participant balance, over $131,000 deposited. So this is not the match amount. This is the amount the youth and families deposited. And that ranged from $10 to $2,000, almost $3,000. There was one individual who was really saving a lot in their account, and averaged $250, which makes sense because that was the goal. So 70% of the youth continued to save in their IDAs after promise. So continued engagement in those IDAs. They all had to be done by the end of March 2019, but that was something they continued to do even after most of promise services have been done. So there's definitely motivation for utilizing those accounts, and that's really helping youth and families towards their path to financial self-sufficiency. Another key component that I haven't mentioned yet was the community. So we were really a big piece is connecting youth and families to their communities, and some were disconnected, and really starting to have that conversation at the community level of what's possible, what employment is possible, and how can community members increase the possibilities for youth with disabilities to work right in their own communities. So we did this in urban communities, so we did this in Milwaukee, we did this in rural communities, we did this in multiple places. In addition, in that final year, right after services were over, so from October 2018 through the end of July of 2019, 97 of our Promise Youth and Family members became part, actively started on a project to increase employment for youth with disabilities in their own community. They did a variety of different projects. For example, one Promise Youth connected other students with disabilities in her high school and helping them apply for local internships and apprenticeships. And these didn't have to be disability specific, but they might be eligible for those, and she helped them find them and apply for them. There was a Promise Youth who worked with the City Council to improve road safety for biking to and from work. And another Promise mom who negotiated with a local cab company for assistance to drop off, pick up, and then also negotiated a lower cost for individuals with disabilities.
These events are really critical because what we know from all kinds of industries and situations is that businesses learn best from other businesses.
I have a daughter who has intellectual disabilities, and so I wanted to come this afternoon to learn what's out there to help support and get my daughter into the workforce.
When you look at the war on talent, the one sector of our community that I think it's forgotten and invisible is people with disabilities, and they are ready to go into the workforce.
We're not always open-minded to understanding what the value and the nuances are, and in fact the beauty of folks who live with disabilities and what they can add to a team.
They're the ideal employee, they're the total package.
I never was late. I took 2 buses. I was up at 3:30, out the door on the 63 bus to the 28 bus. I'm not gonna just sit around.
I own my own apartment, so I pay all the bills. I enjoy it.
People with disabilities, people who have often been disadvantaged, left out, marginalised for no other good reason than prejudice and low expectations. My appeal to employers in the room is, you can open that door.
I have 3 children. I have one on the autism spectrum. He now works full-time. He drives the car. He has his own insurance, and he's just starting his 401k.
Most employers that I talk to will say that their whole office or their whole department changed because of the person with the disability that was actually there working.
This is all about getting questions answered and getting the opportunity for businesses to tell the story that it really does work.
This is a really exciting time for our community, for the disability community, for individuals with disabilities who are looking for employment. There's a lot of possibilities out there.
I would just say take advantage of all of the opportunities that are out there, either through Goodwill or DVR or the school district.
Carving jobs out to help individuals increase their self-esteem, their independence, and making them more productive, and it's really making a difference.
It makes me proud to see other kids or adults that have disabilities and their success stories, and that they are able to live on their own and pay their bills, and it just gives me hope that my daughter will be able to do that someday too.
It's not to do somebody a favor or make a spot for somebody. These are individuals who are extremely talented.
When you go in for an interview, you need to look at the person, not the wheelchair.
Employers need good employees. Employees want a good job. It's just that perfect match.
There are many solutions out there if we start talking and networking together.
Okay, and that was actually one of the, we had small grants for community conversations. I don't know if grant's the right word, but small amounts of money who wanted to follow through on their own community goals to increase employment opportunities for youth in their communities, and that is one of the projects that Milwaukee did. But like I said, we were statewide. We even had a community conversation up on a reservation. We had a community conversation in every single part of our state, like I said, urban and rural areas as well. So it wasn't only about connecting youth and families, but also the whole community. Because really what we're showing and demonstrating over and over again, that youth and their family members have so much to give to the community. They are part of the solution to the workforce needs throughout the state. The employers are looking for good, dependable employees, and our youth and families fit in, according to their interests, abilities, skills, of course, but once you make that match, they're helping to solve a lot of workforce needs across the state, and we want to be able to demonstrate that over and over again. So specifically, trying to keep an eye on the clock here, lessons learned. So what we found was that, yes, folks are out there, yes, they're eligible for services and supports, but they're not necessarily connected. So how can we do that? So we want more targeted outreach for SSI youth and their families. And what we found in Wisconsin Promise, that even something as simple as postcards, something you could read on your way to the trash can is what I like to say, because one of our community connectors shared this with us. Not a lot of words, but like, hey, this might be helpful for you. And they're reading it as they're about to throw it away, and they're like, wait a minute, I want to check this out. So better outreach strategies to really get at youth and families. And some states are like, well, we don't know who they are. So one nice thing in Wisconsin is Medicaid. You can be eligible for Medicaid because youth are on SSI. So we actually built a partnership with our Medicaid department in order so that they could pull a list. We had the Social Security list for this project, but the Medicaid addresses were actually more up to date. And so that's something we can continue to do in the future. In addition, that targeted case management or family navigators to really help connect families, youth and families to supports, especially Voc Rehab Services, but other employment services that are available in the state. What makes sense for the youth and family members? Definitely being person-centered about that. So strength-based, person-centered, building in empowerment, using things like rapid engagement, motivational interviewing, trauma-informed care, if you're going to do that targeted case management, making sure it's employment focused, and incorporating that Social Security navigation piece, that benefits piece, not only to balance, to ensure that folks are getting the services and supports that they need, but also that they're maximizing their income, increasing their financial self-sufficiency. What's that path? And so is there a way to build in targeted case management for SSI youth and families? Yes, they're eligible for different services and supports, but there's not a main mechanism for doing that nowadays. And how can you do that? And actually our article regarding the cost of doing something like that and the benefits of doing something like that is highlighted in that JVR double special issue. The other piece was interagency data sharing. So what we were able to pull off and promise is we actually pulled agency data from DVR, employment and training programs, DHS, so Medicaid, long-term care, school data, child welfare data. So we've got all that pulled together. And not only did that help us track outcomes, engagement, interagency collaboration, but it's also letting us look at, okay, what is that combination of services and supports? How can we better provide services and supports for youth and their families? And we're continuing to analyze that data, but we're also talking at the state level, is this something that makes sense if we want to increase competitive integrated employment for all individuals with disabilities in our state? Is this a interagency data sharing option? Does that make sense moving forward? I talked about community conversations. Other lessons learned, providing services where youth are at, which might mean at the schools. So the pre-employment transition services as part of WIOA is a good mechanism for that. And a collaboration across plans. So the IEP to the IPE, and if needed, that long-term care. Is that bridge happening? And then we also started dabbling, and I'm not going to have a lot of time to talk about, but the improving the capacity around customized employment and supported employment. You saw that when we did connect youth to supported employment services, that they got jobs. Can we better provide that capacity to ensure that youth that might need those additional supports to help on matching those interests, the skills, connecting them to employers really increases. And is there the service providers able to do that and get the funding? Does the funding structure support service providers to do that, meeting the needs of our consumers? All right. In addition, improve service delivery and accessibility for SSI youth and their family members. So implementing those best practices learned through Promise. And that family support piece, where does that fit in? Work across agencies to ensure that family members with youth and SSI have the support needed to navigate services and systems and information on post-school possibilities. So the trick is a lot of service programs are focused on the individual who's eligible, but sometimes, like for example, when you're working with transition age youth, working with the whole family can make a huge difference. So where do we build that into our service systems? We currently have a bill introduced to possibly provide that additional support. We'll see if that gets passed or not, but that's an open question after Promise. And then I mentioned over and over again, and I'll just highlight it here, that Promise, especially in Wisconsin, really helped our DVR with their pre-employment transition services. So utilizing what the tech specs we used for the technical specifications we used for skills to pay the bills, soft skills training and Promise are now tech specs right in DVR. Work instead of benefits counseling, we found a full-blown analysis sometimes was too much information for families all at once, a little bit overwhelming. So we did more of a consult model, really meeting families where they're at and working through issues over time. And so that's now incorporated within our Voc Rehab. Now DVR is looking at a statewide system to ensure financial capability training. It's possible right now, but sometimes folks don't even think of that as a possible service and how that fits in with everything else. So do you make it more apparent and promote it more, or provide more information on the benefits of utilizing financial capability trainings. Self-advocacy training, really learned a lot. We had an online module, and we really found that they use in-person training, hands-on experience, practice was the better way. And so we also were informed a lot in this project on the use of technology. Technology, those face-to-face meetings, those building relationships were so important, but then in between meetings and communication, technology was so important. Texting to keep youth engaged, family members engaged, knowing how to connect with families, even when some of their forms of communication changed. They moved, phone number changed. Our family advocates actually found setting up a professional Facebook account so they could message family members was a good way to continue to connect with youth and family members whose phone numbers might change on a regular basis. So the phone number might change, but the Facebook account doesn't, so they could still message them. Is just one example. So we were learning different ways to communicate and engage with youth and families. Again, that face-to-face, meeting families where they're at, so important, but how do we supplement that with technology to make it that communication ongoing, and we don't lose that the good communication that's happening. And I talked about these other pieces already, the importance of relationships with schools and other service programs. And of course, how we implemented the services made a big difference. Rapid engagement, meaning are we constantly making progress, moving forward towards that goals, the motivational interviewing, especially for those who are ambivalent, and of course, trauma-informed care, trauma-informed care, trauma-informed care. And then also looking at moving forward and expanding credentials and measurable skills gains, implementing those best practices, and I think I already mentioned the family support. Some of these are repeated. So I shared some of the employment that was happening during high school, and I'm trying to decide, there's so many videos we have, and I'm going to open this up. I'm leaning toward maybe sharing Davionte's story, because we highlight his journey to going all the way to post-secondary. But we have a lot of good videos here. So promisewi.com/videos, and you'll see here's Davionte's story. We have some family stories. So if you want to look at the full families, that's a fun way to look at it. The Clemens Clarks, the Boston Baileys. Matthew has a great story up in northwestern Wisconsin. And then there's some good Milwaukee stories, Craig's story. Raina, there's a focus on trauma-informed care here. Avi up in the Green Bay area. That's a fun story. Cody working on welding and with some of his physical disabilities had to do some welding one-handed, but still on the pathway to welding. And then Robert, the most enthusiastic employer you'll ever see. He was working at a car wash, and the employer just so excited for his working. But I'm going to share the post-secondary one. It's so hard oh wait, it's 12:28. All right, well, you guys are going to have to watch because I think I'm running out of time. Sorry. Heidi, do I need to? Oops.
Ellie, so far we only have 2 questions, so I think you're good to run a couple of the videos if you'd like.
Do I have time?
Yep.
Okay. Then I will.
That's kind of the way I visualize visualize the world. It's like a big canvas, and all you need is your tools or your brush. And you can paint it into whatever you want it to be. And make the best out of it, you know, because that's all you get. When it's gone, it's gone.
He's very outgoing. He's very personable. I think he just loves engaging with people. He has a very big personality.
There are a lot of distractions, a lot of wrong turns that these youth can make. So it's really important for us to get involved at an early age.
He never wanted anything to stop him from looking for a job. Daviante struggled with sickle cell, so sometimes he had to go to the hospital because he had a lot of pain in his legs or in his arms. He did not let that stop him at all. But just because you have this sickle cell disease, that does not stop you from exceeding all of your goals. And it hasn't. Daviante started in Promise his junior year in high school. So Daviante, what are your employment goals?
I actually want to have like my own art studio.
Promise is a grant-funded program that works with youth with disabilities, and what we do is try to get kids exposed to work at an early age.
That's where ideas, careers, futures are formed at a younger age. The younger, the better. But each summer he came back and he was doing more and more and better. I just became a fan.
First consumer that I had that was actually graduated from high school and was in college.
It's okay to go to college. It's okay to be smart. It's okay to go to work every day and get up, earn your money, and work hard for that.
He started working for me last year as a lab monitor, and he is very happily working with me again this semester, hanging out in the lab. Also, he can help students out, work as a tutor in that role.
Daviante has such a creative spirit. He has been an inspiration for each of us in the department.
They create a savings goal and they can save for a major purchase.
The biggest thing with me about having a vehicle was to just be able to be self-reliant and self-dependent. I need to get myself from point A to point B.
As he progressed, I got excited for his future and his career path. He saw his future. He knew what he wanted to do.
I want to be a brand. So like if you see this logo, you know that's me.
And he's extremely proud of his work. He would show me his portfolio. I'm like, wow. You're so motivated and you don't let your disability get in the way of you achieving all of your goals.
I want to use my story to inspire others to go out and do certain things that they feel is impossible.
When you first started the Promise program, you were a junior in high school.
Yes, I was. Now I'm a junior in college. From 2 years ago, I didn't even think we would be here.
Extremely proud of you, and I just can't wait to see what the future holds for you.
You've been on this journey with me. That's actually how I feel. And it's been hard, but I know I ain't been like doing it by myself. Now, I appreciate you, Wisconsin Promise, for putting me in this position.
All right, and Heidi, you said we had time for a couple. What time do we get done here? It's 12:34.
We usually wrap it up around 12:30. We've lost a few people. If you can't stay any longer, that's perfectly fine. We will go ahead and get written answers to the questions and make those available with all those other materials. So the questions that we had, we'll go ahead and just take two. One of them was, did you face more negative attitudes from employers to those with only mental health and behavioral disabilities? So did there seem to be a difference between the employers who had people with mental health issues rather than physical issues?
That's a good question. What we tend to find with employers overall is for youth, they tend to be more open to different options, knowing it's going to be, they like the idea of employing youth, knowing that it doesn't always run smoothly. That said, were there specific situations where we had some youth who got tried a bunch of different jobs and were fired from a bunch, and those were typically more mental health behavioral related. Maybe even some of the past trauma getting in the way there. So with those youth, finding that really good job match was so vital. So a good, individual placement support model makes a lot of sense for those individuals. And I know in Wisconsin, we want to get better at that for our youth receiving mental health or having a mental health diagnosis or having behavioral related concerns. I think with Promise, we demonstrated we had made a lot of gains in that area, but it's definitely an area we want to continue to grow in. The good news is when we had the community conversations and really talking about potential, that we had a lot of employers who came to the table willing to try and had lots of success. So if you look at, I lost my mouse, it's gone. But if you look, oh, here we go. If you have a chance to watch Robert's video, and I'm trying to remember what his disability is, you'll see a very energetic and enthused employer. But it's a good question. Like, I think we need to continue to work on that, work on the stigma related to mental health and behavioral, and really working to find that good job match. I think it's out there. It's sometimes a little trickier, but continuing to have those community conversations opens a lot more employers open to the possibilities, especially in our workforce economy today. So I hope that helps.
That's a great answer. Thanks, Ellie. And it segues really nicely into the next question. This will be our last question. There are two more after that, but in respect to everybody's time, we'll have Ellie type up some answers to those, and they'll be included with all the materials from today's webcast. So the question that we have, the last question we'll have is, how were businesses recruited to participate?
So that's a good question. So it was through the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. So with that, every job was individualized. So we have employment providers throughout the state who do job placement, supportive employment, customized employment services. And so they work individually with the student to connect the student to jobs, to trial work experiences. One thing I will say is what worked really well, and which is increasing in VR now, is connecting youth to job shadows.
Oh, okay.
So when the employment provider connected them to job shadows, that usually led to a trial work experience, which usually led to a more permanent job. So it was individualized for each youth with the employment provider. I think if you're interested in getting a lot of employers engaged in maybe like doing a summer youth program, things like that, Arkansas model was more outreach to employers and connecting youth to summer jobs. And I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe one of their JVR articles speaks specifically to that type of model.
Super. Well, Ellie, we're a little bit over time, and thanks to everybody who was able to stay for a little bit. Terry, I'm going to hand it over to you. Anything to add before we let everybody get on with their day?
Get on with their day. No, thanks very much. If we'll leave the site open up briefly, Jen put information in the chat box about obtaining your CRC credits. And again, those of you that attended, you will get an email tomorrow and there'll be instructions about that, but Jen also put some additional information in the chat box. She also added links in the chat box for those of you that may not have been reviewing it, with links to the Journal of Vocational Rehabilitation special issue that Ellie mentioned in her presentation, as well as a couple of other things. So again, we'll leave the site open for a while for those of you that may want to scan through the chat and check those links. Otherwise, thanks very much. We will be having additional webinars through the rest of this year, as well as all of 2020. If you have registered for any of our webinars, you will get notice of those, and we expect them to be at the same level of quality that Ellie delivered for us today. So thanks everybody, and we are done.
Thank you, Ellie.